Good morning and welcome to the very first session of the Oxford Africa Business Forum. My name is Chibueze Ewuzie. I'm an MBA student here at the Saϊd Business School, University of Oxford, and I'm really privileged to be setting the stage for what would be a remarkable day, filled with conversations on how Africa can leverage its largest resource, its young population. To provide a bit of context into the conversations that we'll be having today, 60% of Africa's population are under 25 years of age. In 2050, Africa will be home to 452 million people between the ages of 15 and 24. Their drive, ambition, and potential provides African countries with an extraordinary asset. But today, too many of them are devoid of economic prospects and robbed of any say on their future or that of their continent. The commodity cycle of the past decade may have supercharged many African GDPs, but it has created almost no jobs. And while young people are spending more years in school, very few of them are acquiring the skills that the economy actually needs. Therefore, we'll be spending the next 30 minutes discussing with our guests where opportunities abound to get African youths actively engaged towards the continent's sustainable economic growth. So today I'm excited to be speaking with Mr. Gagan Gupta, who is the founder and CEO of Arise, a conglomerate of 3 companies which exclusively focuses on developing and operating industrial parks, infrastructures, and port facilities across Africa. Mr. Gupta supports building an African industry, especially one that focuses on local and sustainable transformation. It is my pleasure to have you here today, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Chibueze. Pleasure is mine. Happy that I'm able to share our views and what we are doing in this continent.
All right, great. So to our wonderful audience, you will get an opportunity to ask a few questions, and I would suggest that you use the chat box to share those questions with us, and I'll do my best to attend to as many of them as time would allow. So we'll just jump right into the conversation now. Mr. Gupta, let's unpack the topic for a moment. How would you describe what it means for Africa to be at a tipping point? And what are the indicators that you've observed that give these statements its credibility?
Sure. Africa is at a tipping point in the sense it's eventually is ready to emerge as the new manufacturing powerhouse. And I think the key 7 trends that we see, and I would divide those trends into external trends and then continental trends. If you see from external trend, a lot of global shift happening from Asian manufacturing powerhouses to Africa. So if you see, the per capita GDP in China, which is now about $10,000 versus about $2,000 sub-Saharan Africa. So clear shift, from the global Asian manufacturing powerhouses to Africa. I think secondly, a strong geopolitical agenda of Western countries to reduce their dependency towards Asia. So today, most of the sourcing is happening from Asia, and there's a lot of geopolitical agenda to move that away. Thirdly, the massive focus on reducing the carbon emissions, and that's by relocating industry. We know about roughly 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to supply chains. So the 3 key global trends. But now when we look at the continent itself, I think the 4 key continental trends, which are very favorable. So first is really access to raw material. If you look at it, Africa produces about 55% of global cashew, but only 10% in value chain. And we can repeat this over various agri and other commodities. We can repeat it over cocoa, we can repeat it over cotton, we can repeat it over manganese. So many products which Africa produces but does not create any value. Secondly, as you pointed out, solid demographics in terms of very cost competitive manpower when compared to Asia. So if you look at, the Asian economies are going to lose, people in the job market, whereas sub-Saharan Africa is going to add same amount of people to the job market. So that's a big change happening from a demographics perspective. Thirdly, clearly, Africa is a fast-growing consumer market. So the population is going to double. You have doubling of the per capita, doubling of the consumption power. And lastly, I think significant steps are being done to improve the business. So when you look at, AFCT, African Free Continental Trade Agreement, and that's really helping change. But I think one thing we have to be cautious. The tipping point will not be all the countries in Africa. There'll be some countries which will do better than others, the countries which have better governance, the countries which are better prepared, they'll do better than others. So I think if you look at all these 7 trends, it's clearly a tipping point for Africa to emerge as a leading manufacturing powerhouse. But I said not all the countries will be there. There'll be some countries who have taken lead in infrastructure and governance, which really benefit out of it.
All right, thank you so much. I mean, you said a lot there, and there was a bit of comparison with Asia and what they've been able to do to be able to leverage the large human resource that they have. Now, let's kind of move to creating opportunities for African youths, and this conversation that has been going on for a long time now. Is there enough being done, to create that distinction between just creating jobs, and actually creating quality jobs? And, given the inclination of, young people in Africa today who are, more interested in sophisticated type of jobs, what would you say can be done, to create opportunities that align their interests, to industries that we actually need to develop our economy?
So I think you've raised a very fundamental point. And, if you just look at some numbers broadly, so about roughly 12 to 15 million, African youth come to the job market every year. And 1/3 of them get into formal jobs. One third of them get into less, less stable informal jobs. And 1/3 of them do not get any jobs. So that's really in terms of numbers. But what we need to do is look at creating stable jobs across. But what has happened is, as you rightly pointed out, over the last 5 to 10 years, the job creating sectors like agriculture and industry have become more distorted by the old school image. So people think agriculture is old school, people think industry is old school, and only what is fashionable is if you're working in a tech or you're working in a biotech, that's fashionable. And I think that distortion is creating a lot of issues. Because one thing we have to remember that even today, only 10% of the African youth is going to universities. So not all will be able to get into that niche market that everybody is focused on. There's still the 90% of people that need to focus on other sectors which create most of the jobs, which is really the industry and agriculture. So I think that core focus has to be there. But what is not helping is 2 things. What is not helping is that the education sector is very differently focused on what the job needs are. So there's a big mismatch between what people are learning and what the job needs are. And that really does not help. So I think one thing clearly that needs to be done is a lot of focus on vocational training. So how can you get people ready towards the jobs that are really required rather than just being trained in something that will not find jobs? And I think also second thing that needs to be done significantly is in terms of very close cooperation between the industry and the education sector. And that can also happen if we involve a lot of private sector in the education, because then you start orienting education towards where people will find meaningful jobs. I think purely if you look from a overall perspective, I would say that the jobs will come from agriculture, will come from industry. And as you shift manufacturing, those jobs will get added. But what we need to do is ensure that we have a lot of vocational training, ensure there's alignment between what the need is and what people are getting trained, ensure private sector involvement in that. They'll really help towards stable job creation.
All right. I mean, I'm so glad that you actually mentioned that, because I mean, on a personal level, I mean, I can relate, and the mismatch between the educational sector and actually what the job market seeks, that mismatch, has been the subject of several conversations I've had with friends over the years. Let's take the market system approach now, which kind of favors the development of market systems as a means to tackle poverty. What are the characteristics, of the labor market in sub-Saharan Africa that you've observed, and where do you see the most potential to, effectively integrate African youth into labor markets?
So I think really, as I said, I think, so if you summarize what we were discussing earlier, there are 3 issues in terms of, first is job creating sectors are not seen as really the friendly sectors. They're seen more as old school sectors. I think secondly, most of the attractive careers are very inaccessible because of hierarchical nature, because of, still considered that only expatriates can do this job. Thirdly, lack of hard skills in terms of especially the technical jobs, the engineers that are really key enablers. I think what really needs to be done is first going beyond the stereotypes. So ensuring that job creating sectors are evolving the technology. So agriculture is becoming more and more tech oriented. So ensuring that we are able to get these sectors also to be more not old school, but new school. I think secondly, also counting on the young local talent to allow them to build their own pathways in leadership. So example is what we do in our companies. We have so many young, talent from within the continent that is leading some of our key businesses. So ensuring that we allow the young talent. I think thirdly, very important as we discussed a little bit is intensifying the technical education. But I think more important one part, which I think we miss, is also how do we enable the youth to be entrepreneurs? So one thing that I see that lacks most of the time is very little African capital is going to create African companies. Most of the time, it is expected that foreign companies will come and create jobs. I think that narrative also needs to change. You need to have more African capital creating African jobs, which means how do you also convert more and more African youth to be entrepreneurs? So when you go to a market, which is, for example, a wholesale market, how do you see that it's also people from within the continent operating that wholesale market? So creating that entrepreneur class is also very important. And that entrepreneur within Africa can have create 30, 40 jobs or 50 jobs. I think that is also very important.
And I mean, how would you say Arise has participated in trying to shape the perception of young people? The approach of your organization has been to develop industrial ecosystems across Africa, and you've set up industrial zones in Gabon, Benin, and Togo, with Cote d'Ivoire and Chad currently under development. Now, what is the strategy being used to unlock value, create new industry, and of course, change the perception of African young people to find those kind of sectors that you're focused on to get them interested in those sectors?
I think if we work at what we do at Arise, so at Arise we do two things. When we look at a country and we say what this country is currently importing. So you say look at a country like, say, if you look at west coast of Africa, most of the countries are importing pharmaceuticals products. Then you look at a country and say what this country can export competitively. So what this country has, which it can export competitively. So any country that we look at saying, okay, this country is importing this product. Then we look at this country and saying what this country can export competitively. So example, in case of Gabon that you talked about, Gabon used to export round logs. So you said this country has raw material in terms of round logs. Can it graduate to doing plywood? Can it graduate to doing, say, a particle board? Can it graduate to doing furniture? Or if you go to, say, Benin has cotton, exporting raw cotton. Can this country graduate to doing garmenting? Or Benin does cashew nuts. Can this country, rather than just exporting raw cashew, can it graduate to exporting finished products? So when we design any industrial zone, what we look at is each country saying specifically, okay, what is that the country is importing? What is that country exporting? Then we build the entire ecosystem around it. When I say ecosystem, it's a broad term, because what we realize is the reason that transformation has not happened in Africa for the last 50 years. And it's not just by us coming and saying that we'll build an industrial zone, the transformation will happen. In our view, 4 key things that lack. Firstly, it's the policy framework. So we work with the governments to ensure there's a policy framework. We typically end up establishing a public-private partnership under which the government takes some stake, we take a stake, and we run that company. Yes. The second thing that we very important to do is ensure that we have the hard infrastructure, which is you build the roads, water, electricity, which is basic necessity for the industry to work. The third thing that we do, and which is very important, is how do you ensure that you have trained manpower? So how do you ensure that you have people who can meet the demand of this industry? And there's no one, strategy that you can approach. Each country we do differently. So example, in Gabon, we have a vocational training center that was built in partnership with the government, and we train people there. And we also have something called on-the-job training, whereby they spend, say, a day in the classroom, and then 5 days they actually work in the industry itself. So that in 12 to 18 months' time, they have learned the job and they can be absorbed in the industry. And what has that meant in Gabon? So typically, companies started with, say, about 40, 50% expatriates. Today, most of them are operating at less than 10% expatriates because they've been able to train people on the job. But if you move to, say, a country like Benin and Togo, where we have focused a lot on garmenting and a lot in textile, we believed for textile industry to be successful, you need a lot of trained manpower. So we are building in both the countries vocational training centers. And each of these training centers will be training 4,000 people each. The industries will come in operation only next year, but the training centers will be operational this May. So that allows you to train people. That is what we are doing in terms of training people. But if you move, to a little bit higher, I think what we do is really give opportunities to people at very young age. So if you look at, somebody who heads our Ivory Coast operations, used to be our communication manager in Gabon. Now she heads our Ivory Coast operations. The person who is going to head our Senegal operation is from Gabon. Very young, he joined us. We gave him a lot of, experience, and now he's going to head our operations. So typically, also giving the talent a lot of opportunities at early age. The fourth thing that we do in our industrial approach is saying how can we differentiate from a sustainability perspective. So we keep sustainability at the core of our business, and that we do it in various forms and fashions. For example, ensuring carbon positivity. So our industrial zone in Gabon is carbon neutral, ensuring that we do life cycle carbon assessment for each products, so that you can measure a t-shirt coming from Togo or Benin, what is the carbon footprint versus a t-shirt coming from China, and that acts as a differentiator. I think combination of all this is something that does two things. So you train the manpower, but also you make it attractive for them to come and work. And that is the reason we have created roughly about 26,000 jobs in Gabon. And we are on way to create close to 30,000 jobs in Togo and about 100,000 in Benin. And that'll be mostly, I would say, 90 to 95% people from within the continent.
All right, thank you. I really want to ask about the challenges that you've faced so far, because like what you really described is a really large operation, and having to partner with the government to execute that kind of project sounds like a very complex thing to do. But before I get to that question, I want to take one of the questions from the audience, and it says, it will be interesting to also learn how you think we can make the non-attractive industries and sectors attractive and interesting. And how do we also drive massive social and venture investments in non-tech scaling sectors?
I think very valid question. And I will, talk of two things. First, there's a significant portion of people who are not going to universities. And this, so a lot of times, I mean, all of us, Chibueze, yourself, myself, we focus only on the people who are going to universities. And we say, how can we create jobs for them? That's very important, and jobs are getting created. But at the same time, we also need to focus on people who are not going to universities or might not be able to go to them. So we need to look at creating jobs for themselves, that set also. And that's a larger set. I think, and I'll address for both of them. As far as people who are not going to universities, I think we need to create more vocational training center, ensure that we create enough industrial jobs for them. And these industrial jobs are more stable and are better working conditions. At the same time, we need to make jobs in agriculture more attractive. Yeah. And that you can make more attractive when you ensure that the person who is doing the agriculture is getting the right value for its hard work. Because if you look at a value chain today, for example, if you look at a cashew value chain, or if you look at a pineapple value chain, you'll be surprised that the farmer only gets between 5 to 10% of the overall value. It's a very small portion for the owner of the resource. So if you're able to push back more and more value to that resource owner, you will see that it becomes more attractive for him to be there, because he says, I'm getting right remuneration for my hard work. I'm getting right remuneration for my resource. And how do we do that? I think, and therefore it's very important when we look at this, we look at seeing how can we transform the product within the continent and within that resource. For example, if you were to transform, say, if you were to export a round log, so imagine you are a producer of round log, you export round log, you get 150 euros a cubic meter. But the moment you transform into furniture, you get 4,000 euros a cubic meter. So what we need to do is ensure that these owners of resources are able to transform full value, so they get much higher value. The moment they get higher value, it becomes interesting for them. Similarly, for the industry, we need to ensure that these jobs are very right from a perspective of right working conditions. They bring the right healthcare, they bring the right other infrastructure for them, and that'll start making them attractive. The second part of the question was about how do we drive massive social ventures and investment in non-tech scaling sectors. Anything to do with, so the way we look at it ourselves, while we are for-profit organization, But what we are driving is nothing but massive social venture, in the sense that all our industrial zones create massive amount of jobs. And what you need to do is, for any of them to be successful and to be scalable, you need to ensure that they can be replicable. And how do you do that? You need to ensure that there's some economic return associated with it, so that people clearly see that, yes, this is something that can be scaled up. The second part, you can also start thinking, and since all of you, some of you are from Oxford School, how can you start focusing on sustainable development goals? So can you start saying that, okay, this particular business is going to improve 10 SDGs, and then we can measure these SDGs, and then we can go back and give to those industries these SDGs which are not able to impact the SDGs. So imagine an extractive industry. They don't create jobs, they don't improve, say, rural healthcare, they don't improve rural education, because they operate in extractive industry that's operating offshore. But imagine if you create a venture which says, what, we can impact these 10 SDGs, and go to an extractive industry and say, what, our venture create these SDGs. Will you be willing to buy these SDGs? And there'll be enough of people wanting to do that. So there are innovative ways whereby, you can scale up a lot of social ventures.
Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I really wish we could, take it even further. However, we're kind of pressed for time. So I'm going to have to, just get a few closing statements from you. Taking into consideration the challenges, that you've encountered, with setting up these industrial areas, changing the mindset of young people, trying to focus on youth who are not able to attend, tertiary or traditional education. What would you say, is the future that you see for Africa? And in a few sentences, what are the few changes that you would like to see happen to bring that future that you see to life?
So I think I believe that the Africa future is very strong and very bright. And I believe Africa will define and follow its own path of prosperity. The idea is not for Africa to be new China, but an economic powerhouse that's creating an unprecedented economic model of its own. And Africa will lead the sustainable path to industrialization. So Africa is fortunate, like it leapfrogged in terms of telephone, directly to mobile phones. I think Africa will be the key pivot in terms of sustainable industrialization. And it'll do by leapfrogging high carbon emitting industries, production models directly in sustainable mode, in positive carbon mode. Secondly, Africa will lead the circularity debate. So as they set up these manufacturing hubs, it'll be leading the circularity agenda. I think what needs to be done is, how do we ensure that the vast continent's resources are used for its own benefit? So it really means that it's focused on transforming its own raw materials locally, and rather than exporting them. Because when you're exporting raw material, you're basically exporting jobs and importing unemployment. So I think how that Africa changes that. Secondly, very important, it focuses on creating jobs for all segments of the African youth, and not just one segment, which is the segment which is fully learned and can debate, but the segment which is not even able to come to this forum, is not able to come to this table to talk about what needs to be done. Thirdly, very important is to export finished products and change this mindset, everything has to be imported. And I think all this combined with a feeling of pride and belonging, that yes, this is our own economic model, will make the impact and make the change.
All right. Thank you so much. I think you rounded that up really nicely. And I want to use the opportunity to just thank you for taking the time to speak to us. And to our wonderful participants, thank you for your participation. Unfortunately, we couldn't take all your questions, but I'm sure that, from the conversations that had just taken place, I'm sure that you've learned a thing or two about what, Mr. Gupta and his company are really doing, to change things on the continent. So from me, it's been a pleasure being your host, and I look forward to all of you joining us at the next session in just a few minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Chibueze. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.